Hotep, I'm Dr. Gloria Lattimore Peace, host and producer of OmniU Presents the H3O Art of Life show. And I'm very pleased to have my guest, Kamm Howard, today of Cobra, because we're going to discuss the title of the show, Caught in the Act. We're talking about another ACT, the African captive trade. I think it's erroneously called the slave trade, but the first trade was the trade in captives, free black people who were taken forcibly from their environment and put into a situation where they were seasoned and transformed into what was later the chattel slave trade. So I think it's important for us to understand that when we're talking about caught in the act, we're talking about catching those who perpetrated that atrocity on human beings of African descent. And we're talking about the human beings of African descent who have been victimized and continue to be victimized by the fallout from that continued practice. And I think that I have probably the best person to have this discussion with, because he has been waging a long struggle for reparations for these heinous acts committed against our ancestors and against ourselves. And I'm happy to invite you to talk about this for however long you want, uninterrupted by any trivial questions.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Peace, and I'm
You're
happy
welcome.
to be here. Thank you.
All right.
For inviting me.
So go ahead and tell us what it is you've been doing and why.
Okay, I'm with Cobra. Cobra is the National Coalition of Blacks for Reparations in America. It's a coalition of individuals and organizations that was first formed in 1987. And it's been organized for the sole purpose of winning reparations for descendant Africans here in America who were subjected to that period of enslavement and also Jim Crow segregation and the 390 years of crimes against humanity that we've been subjected to in this country. So I've taken upon this as a cause of my life, is to make sure that our ancestors are repaid for the atrocities that you stated that were committed against them.
Now you have a graphic here, so why don't we talk about this graphic?
Okay, the graphic is a graphic pictorial of the U.S. Senate apology for the enslavement of our ancestors. Most of our people are not aware, and I'm out with this graphic around the city of Chicago, and it's something that Cobra has a national initiative, a national drive to get this graphic out. And the reason is that most of our people are not aware that the United States Senate apologized to us in June of 2009 for the enslavement of our ancestors and for Jim Crow segregation. And so we created this graphic to show exactly what that apology looked like. And if our people actually knew what it looked like, then there would be a mass response. And so that's why we created it, and that's what we're doing, trying to get it out.
So let's read this.
Okay, the apology, the apology was comprised of 3 parts.
Okay.
And we put each of those parts on a scale of reparative justice. And that's what you see here is a scale which represents justice. And, so we put each part on the scale. And the first part of the apology were the crimes that they confessed to. In 2001, the United Nations at the Durban Conference Against Racism in Durban, South Africa, declared the act, as you stated, the transatlantic slave trade, as crimes against humanity. So the first part of their apology was a confession of those crimes. 246 years of enslavement, 100 years of Jim Crow segregation, the near and attempted destruction of our culture, the near and attempted destruction of our families, the brutality and the dehumanizing acts committed against our people during enslavement, and the terrorism and brutality that was committed against our people after enslavement. All of those are listed in the first part of that apology, as well as other crimes. And we put that on one side of the scale. The second part of the apology is what they resolve to do about these crimes. They say that we acknowledge this criminality, we apologize for this criminality, we recommit to fairness, justice, and equality, and we ask all Americans to help end racism. So when we put that on the other side of the scale, we can see automatically it doesn't balance the scale. 390 years of criminality, and that's the redress that they offer. But then there was a third part to the apology, which was a disclaimer, which was like a structure that they put underneath the apology, which basically said, you cannot use this apology as a claim against the United States government, and you cannot use this apology as a claim for reparations. So in essence, they said, okay, we acknowledge that we committed 390 years of criminality against your people. We apologize, but we owe you nothing and you deserve nothing. So NCOBRA stamped that insufficient redress. It's redress, but it's not sufficient for the amount of criminality that was perpetrated against our people. And in some areas in international law, acknowledgement of a wrong is sufficient redress. In other areas, an apology is sufficient redress. But for 390 years of criminality, simple acknowledgement and apology is insufficient redress.
Well, you know, I don't want to be the advocate, the devil's advocate, but I do want to tell you some of the things, the defenses I've heard against reparations. One of them was that because we do know that the Japanese people received reparations for their internment during the Second World War.
That's right.
And so we say, well, you know, if these people they were Japanese Americans, if these people could receive reparations and redress for their maltreatment, then why certainly could we not have received an equal redress for our maltreatment? And the first defense that I heard was that there was no redress because slavery was legal, and consequently what they did to the Japanese was not legal, because these were Americans and they were treated unfairly, unjustly. But in our case, since we were not considered to be Americans at the time, at least at the outset of the enslavement, then it was legal to have slaves. It was legal to mistreat them or treat them however however we were treated, and no redress was therefore required. Have you heard that argument?
I have not heard that, but my statement to that is simple fact that it may have been legal. It may have been written into the law. In fact, it wasn't written into the law of the Constitution, but prior to the 13th Amendment, where it was written into the Constitution as there should be no enslavement unless duly convicted of a crime should exist. So that was the first mention of it in the Constitution, except for the 3/5 of
the Missouri Compromise,
exactly.
3/5 of a man.
Right. So, but the United Nations again in 2001 stated it as a crime against humanity, and as such, even if it was a law, it was illegal according to international standards.
Because we're not talking about civil rights here, we're talking about human rights.
Exactly.
And Malcolm was quite correct when he raised the discussion, because we had been fighting for civil rights, for the right to vote, for the right to be integrated. Well, actually, my read on it was that the movement that black people initiated was a movement for justice, and it was not a movement toward integration. We were not trying to be integrated. We were just simply trying to be treated the way that other people are treated who have served and lived in this country and have been recognized as citizens. That's what we were trying to do. But it became something called civil rights, a movement called civil rights, and the right to go to school with people, the right to sit at a lunch counter, the right to sit in the any place in the bus station or in the bathroom, you know, those kinds of things, which were which were niceties and conveniences, but they were never on the level of human rights. And so when Malcolm raised the bar and said, no, we don't want to talk to you about simply civil rights. We want to talk to you about these violations of human rights that the whole world would recognize as violations, then that raised the bar. And so now we're talking about, when we're talking about the legality of enslaving people, we're talking about civil matters. But when you're talking about human rights, then you're talking about exactly what you're talking about. What redress is available and should be made available to people who have suffered abuses of their human rights?
Well, under international law, human rights violations, the redress can take many ways. It could be, as I stated earlier, an acknowledgement of the wrong. It can be an apology. It can be reparations or compensation. It can be setting up sufficient land grants for people to set up their own self-determining communities. So it can take many ways, and that's a debate that's still out there, which form of human rights redress we're looking for. But interesting what you said about Malcolm X. He said you cannot take the criminal to his court, and expect anything different. You have to take him outside of his court, and he was talking about the world court to get these criminal acts addressed. So, yeah.
But then we have such powerful influence throughout the world. We have such powerful influence in world courts, in the United Nations, et cetera, until it's hard to believe that that influence would not be experienced at some level. But given the fact that there are still inequities within the society, that you may not have blatant chattel slavery as we recognize it from social studies books. You still have blatant inequities that are an outgrowth of the practices that came out of the African captive trade, the chattel slavery practices, the Jim Crow, and all of these special arrangements that were made to prevent people of color, people of African descent, from having so-called equal rights or having justice, without respect to their color, or their ancestry. So the fact that this is still present means that the redress or the reparations account continues to grow.
Exactly.
You cannot say that, okay, for this amount of 300 and how many years, 90 years, okay, this is what you owe for 390 years, because it never stopped.
Exactly.
And so and counting, 390 years and counting. So in a situation or in an environment where all you can hear about is the downturn in the economy and the inability of the nation to correct itself or to prevent itself from falling into a deep and profound depression. It sort of seems futile to keep talking about you owe money, you have this debt, and you're paying everybody else's dets but your own. You're paying the debts for the auto industry and for the banking industry, and you're paying everybody else's debts with funds that belong to people. And yet the people's debts are not being rectified.
I agree. That's totally so. That's the dilemma that we're facing, and that's part of the reason why it's difficult in this particular time to get more people to join this movement, because they seem to think it's kind of futile in this economic environment. But the fact is that things will get worse if they're not addressed. The longer they are waited, the longer it takes for them to address these issues, these disparities, and what COBRA is listed as 5 injury areas that are prevalent in our communities, from chattel enslavement and from Jim Crow segregation, the disproportionate number of African American men and women incarcerated, the lack of educational opportunities for our children, the imbalance and inequities in education, the disproportionate representation of African American people in the health disorders and the major health disorders are direct lingering effects of the period of enslavement, and other lingering effects. These things will get worse if we do not insist that this particular government addresses them now. There was a report by the King Center that stated it would take 1,664 years for African Americans to become on par with white Americans in the field of, in the area of wealth if we keep moving at the same incremental pace that we moved over the last 40 years. And there's been tremendous advances among African Americans in areas of wealth in the last 40 years, and with a lot of millionaires being made, black millionaires. But even at this particular pace, it would take 1,600 years for us to achieve par. In the area of life chances in the city of Chicago, or lifestyle in the city of Chicago, the Jane Addams House stated it would take 200 years for blacks to achieve the same level of lifestyle as whites in the city of Chicago if things are left to work themselves out as they have been. And with these economic conditions that we're experiencing right now, that gulf is going to get wider unless there's specific targeted responses to our community. And it is just to respond to our community based on this past and present that we've been experiencing.
Well, I think that you have rightfully identified the present day conditions that are directly traceable. It's very important to be able to say this and this are related in a cause-effect fashion.
Exactly right.
And there is practically nothing that you can name that is a challenge to black people, right, or people of African descent, right, that cannot find its way back to the African captive trade, because you have to, first and foremost, you have to recognize that if people are on their own land, minding their own business, with their own way of life, if they are left with that, they have got to be better off than they will be if they are uprooted from that and put into a situation where they cannot determine anything, not only where they are, but who they are and what they can do as they are. And so it's very important to understand that the difference between being autonomous and being chattel or being the property of somebody is there's just no way to explain that. You just can't describe that. You cannot do anything that you decide to do because you belong to someone else who is deciding for you what the parameters of your life are. So that's the first thing. And then, of course, the other thing is that it is known that people do develop health challenges from stress.
From stress.
And you hear people talk about post-traumatic stress disorder. I always take the post off because I think the traumatic stress is still present.
Very much so.
Some of it may have been post, but the stresses of daily life, of living precariously on the edge of an unknown, people who don't know whether they will have employment, right, whether they will have a source of income at all, people who do not know whether they will be able to live wherever they live, whether it's an apartment or a house.
Exactly right.
People who do not know whether they will be able to take care of themselves if they become ill or if someone in their family becomes ill. And when you pointed out that these disparities in our health condition, the fact that we have more of everything to a greater degree than everybody else is a direct relationship, it has a direct relationship to that level of stress.
Right.
Because stress will affect the immune system, it will affect the nervous system, it will just affect you all over. Right. And so consequently, here we are the people who don't have health care. And we are the people who are going to be probably harmed the most by what is now being proposed, which is that you must have it
must
is
have
a mandate. You have to have it. Now, if you don't have any income, where you get the money
To buy
to
it.
pay the premiums from is another thing.
Right.
And then I'm told also, I'm reading and I'm watching, and I'm told also that you also have to, if you have a pre-existing condition, the premiums can be greater.
Right.
Well, if you have been a descendant of captives transformed into slaves, you are carrying, you have inherited some health issues that are a pre-existing condition.
That's
And
right.
every single person that I know has at one time or another been diagnosed with something that's in a record somewhere that says they have this pre-existing condition. So that means you have to have the money to pay for the premiums, and then you have to have more of it because your premiums will be greater. And then the other part of it is that older people, it is proposed that older people will have to pay more because health care for older people tends to be more costly, given the fact that, you know, sometimes they have systems breaking down and whatnot. And so when you look at that and you say, well, now, reparations, you know, if nothing more than to give us the access to being able to restore the good health that we enjoyed when we were at home.
When we're at home, exactly. The stress, the sister, Dr. Joy Leary, she talks about post-traumatic slave syndrome and the overabundant amount of stress that we carried on generationally, that's been birthed into our progeny from generation to generation. And that leads to a breakdown of all the systems, as you stated. And so unless something is interjected into that to halt that, then we're going to continue. And it will get worse. We are seeing, when I was growing up, very few of the young brothers I knew were bald in their 20s and 30s. Now you see bald men in their teens, young brothers losing their hair in their teens. Just one example. And we're going to see that deterioration of the health even more and more unless something is interjected to halt that.
And we see obesity on a massive scale. And that obesity does not come necessarily from the greed of people. It comes from a very poor diet that is so lacking in nutrition that you cannot get a sense of not being hungry. You continue to be hungry because the food that you're eating is deficient in nutrition. And so you eat some more, but all you're getting is calories. All you're getting is grease and starch and fat and sugar and salt. And I'm told that there are places right here in the city where you cannot actually go to a grocery store. You rely on convenience stores nearby because the grocery stores are so far away. And if you don't have transportation to get to those stores, then not only does it cost you more, but you're snacking. You're not having meals.
That's right.
So we have health concerns based upon our inability to feed ourselves properly or even to know what good nutrition is, to even know. Because when you pointed out, the longer you let it go, the worse it gets. Well, if in this generation people learn that, having sodas and chips and cookies and fast foods, if that is the way to feed yourself, it becomes a way of life. People don't think twice, because this is what my mama gave me. This is what I had to eat. And so this is what is normal for people to eat.
That's exactly right. And when you talk about what the term they call food deserts in our community, the lack of food, good food sources, fruits and vegetables and things like that, that speaks also to the debt that is owed from the destruction of our farmlands, and the monies that's owed to our black farmers that they haven't paid, even though they won the lawsuit. They haven't been paid their money. There were millions of acres of black farmland that was taken, or they weren't given the subsidies that white farmers were given, and when they applied for those subsidies, they were discriminated against. And so the ability to even produce the food that we used to be able to produce for our families and ship it and distribute it up north to our communities, that's been taken away.
And I'm glad you mentioned the distribution part of it, because I know farmers right now who live in the Kankakee area who they took the railroad out. You know, so there's a railroad running through there, but there's no railroad train on there. So your ability to be self-sufficient, your ability to take care of yourself, to provide for yourself, to do for self, that the Honorable Marcus Garvey talked about, the Honorable Elijah Muhammad talked about, even James Brown said, I don't want nobody to give me nothing. You know, just get out the way and let us take care of ourselves. Stop building barriers between our well-being and our ability to meet our needs. Because obviously part of reparations has to be, I think, that you just have to leave people alone and let people do the things that they know that to do that will be beneficial to them, to themselves. I can think of so many ways. We used to be able to have midwives to deliver babies at home, and now there are few midwives still licensed in the country to be able to do that. The best place, you know, home, there's no place like home. Home is the best place for birth. It's the best place for schooling. It's the best place for dining. It's the best place for everything. But if you render people homeless, they have no homes in which to do any of this. And if you take away the authority of people to take care of themselves and each other, then you are contributing to a de facto kind of slavery. You know, you don't actually have a slave auction block sitting up in the middle of the community. There's none sitting right there in Bronzeville. But if you make it impossible for people to be self-supporting, then what you have done is created a kind of de facto slavery. That's exactly where people are still slaves.
You set up the conditions that perpetuate this type of behavior and this estranglement amongst the people to do for themselves.
Out of that, you will get the parasitic behavior of people who are trying to survive by feeding on other people. You know, now there's a limit to how much you can steal from people who don't have anything.
That's right.
You know, after you get through going around the community, you know, stealing all the TVs and laptop computers that you could find and automobiles and so forth, eventually there's a limit to how much of that you can do. Now what do you do? Now that you've stolen and pawned all the valuables in the community, now you in the community, you haven't got a damn thing. Nobody else in the community has anything either. And so we are still in the same situation. So it's imperative, I think, for us to recognize that what we're talking about in terms of reparation is reparations for crimes committed against people of African ancestry for over a period of almost 400 years. But we're also saying that nothing has changed. You know, the window dressing has changed. It may appear that things have changed, but your destiny is no more in your hands now than it was during the time when these blatant acts were being committed right before your eyes.
That's exactly right. And that looks like, we talk about, I think, again, to call upon Malcolm X's terminology. I think he was the first to coin the term ghetto colony.
No, that was Eugene Perkins.
Was that Eugene's? Okay.
Yeah, and
okay.
Home is the Dirty Street.
Okay, yeah, Dr. Perkins.
Yeah,
Okay,
okay.
right, and that's we have blacks who are in positions of leadership in the political arenas, in the economic arenas, and in our social institutions. But the institutions are still producing the same effect on the people as they did when there were Europeans in control of those institutions. So, yeah.
Well, we have so
things,
many.
yeah.
We have so many people who don't want to be who they are because they don't know who that is.
Right.
You know, on my last show, I was talking about there was a radio show on which the question was asked, do we still need the Black national anthem or the Negro national anthem? You know, the fact that a question like that could be raised shows that our consciousness has been eroded.
For sure.
Because nobody of any other culture would ask if there needed to be music dedicated to them, if there needed to be any art form dedicated to the honoring and reverence toward their own culture. People have a cuisine that's associated with their own culture. People have art.
That's right.
People have child rearing practices. Every group has things that are distinctly and uniquely theirs, of which they are proud,
Right.
you know, and would not think of surrendering. When you hear people talking about their Irish American or their Polish American or whatever other hyphenated American they are, they have all got something that is uniquely that second part of that hyphen,
Exactly.
that other side of that hyphen. If you don't think you have a St. Patrick's parade marching down the street because the Irish Americans forgot they were Irish.
That's exactly right.
And the thing is that everybody has something that is the glue that keeps them together. In Kalan Phil Karan's segment, he talked about music as being the glue, the cohesive force that held us together and kept us from being splintered and completely separated from each other. Other people have the same kind of cohesion, and their culture is their cohesion.
That's that cohesion, right.
And they have their songs, and they have their celebrations, and they have their holidays. You know, the holidays that we celebrate are Kwanzaa and maybe Black History Month. Beyond that, some people may look at Juneteenth.
Okay. And
But beyond that, we don't have celebrations that are celebrating us as a people. We have a birthday, that's your individual birthday, an anniversary, that's this couple's anniversary. But celebrations of ourselves as a people, those accomplishments, those adversities that we overcame, the things that invigorate people and give them strength and stamina and whatnot. we cannot allow ourselves not to have the cultural nutrition that keeps people alive and keeps them grounded in who they have been for millions of years.
For sure, and that's the internal repair that I've heard you talk about quite a bit. We need the external reparation as well as the internal reparations, what we can do as a people. So we have to put a lot of energy back in, even into the holidays that you spoke of in Kwanzaa. Kwanzaa has become commercialized to a great amount, and we have to go back and reclaim that. Black History Month has to have a particular theme or particular purpose that we can all share upon. One of the things we're doing with the reparations piece for Black History Month is that we're attempting to get African American associations, learning associations, the African American History Institute, or other associations to target February 2011 as Reparations HR 40 Senate Apology Month. So they can create a curriculum that we can institute in schools at the grade school and the high school level, even at the college level, that focus on that month, the teaching of the true history of this country, the debt that the contributions that African made to the wealth of this country. For instance, from the 1862 to 1865, this government earned $58 million in cotton tax, just in a 3-year period. So those type of things that we can teach during that month, and to demonstrate why reparations or why repair is needed. Well, we can know why repair is needed, but to encourage this country or the people and the government to enact legislation for that repair. And so that Black History Month can be useful if we collectively take it upon ourselves to channel it for the internal repair and hopefully the external repair.
Well, you know, I have sometimes referred to Black History Month as Black Biography Month.
Yeah.
Because I don't think it's enough just to teach people about personalities and historical figures. It's good to know that we had Malcolm. It's good to know we had the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, the Honorable Marcus Garvey. It's good to know that we had all of these people who made some sort of contribution, but ultimately what we're saying is that they all, despite all of their hardships and their struggles, they made it.
Right.
You know, so this is not, it's not so bad after all, because all of these people, you know, wound up, Harriet Tubman became a nurse in the Union Army or something, you know.
Right.
So Frederick Douglass, you know, was advising the president, you know. So everybody went from, they pulled themselves up by their bootstraps and they became, you know, important historical figures. Well, that's one thing, to teach people who the people are who have made a mark or who have been notable in history. The other part of it is, if you're gonna teach history, then you need to teach what the true history of the people were, what their practices were. How did African people live? How did an African family live? Who were the mothers? Because African families have more than one mother.
Right.
The sisters of the biological mother are the mothers in some groups. The brothers of the biological father are the fathers.
Right.
So the African family is just, take some time and study that, and just look at how much more children had when they had African families, when they have families based on an African model, which gave them so many parents and so many grandparents that they could never be orphans.
That's right.
You know,
That's
just
right.
let us study how African people related to each other. Let's study African relationships. Let's see how children were treated by their parents, by their grandparents, how siblings treated each other. Okay, how members of the same age grade, meaning the ones who went to school together and say graduated together or were circumcised during the same time. Let's look at how they related to each other and to their children, because they treated each other's children as though the children belonged to them. So we could just take some time out and learn how Africans live. Let's look at this group of Africans. And I'm not interested in female genital, all of that stuff, because you know, I've read Facing Mount Kenya by Jomo Kenyatta. I understand what that was, and I understand why it was. And I also understand that the hysterectomy is so common in the South among women of African descent that it's called the appendectomy. It's called an appendectomy because it's so common. So when you look at the fact that they're removing the entire reproductive system from females, and that's a common practice in some parts of this country, and we're excited over the clitoridectomy, which is the proper name for this genital mutilation, It's the clitoridectomy. The clitoridectomy leaves a woman completely intact to continue to bear children. A hysterectomy removes the woman's ability to ever reproduce or to ever be a parent, a mother. So we're not excited about that. We're not excited about the growing number of hysterectomies are even used as a contraceptive. You've had enough children, so why don't you just have all of that removed? So I'm saying, let us take a serious look at Africa. Let's look at relationships, and let us not read what non-Africans have written about Africa, but let us get some people who live there, who know these practices, who know how Africans relate to each other, because that's their ancestry. So if we want to know something about what goes on in among the Zulus of South Africa, let us have Zulus come and teach us. If we want to know something about the Maasai of Kenya, or if we want to know something about the Kikuyu, you know, let's find somebody who can tell us about that, or at least if we can't find somebody in the flesh, let us go to the African who wrote that story. Let us get our stories from the horse's mouth. So there's a lot that we could do with Black History Month if we would quit. I love Sojourner Truth and Harriet Tubman and Coretta Scott King and all of those people. They are wonderful people. But knowing Coretta Scott King's life does not teach me about my ancestry. I just know her struggle. I need to know those things that I can fall back on when I'm trying to solve problems in my family. I need to know how did my family traditionally solve disputes between a husband and a wife.
Yeah, there's so much that we need to go back to our culture, traditions, and pick up. I was talking to a brother at the Kwanzaa celebration, and he stated that he saw a brother, he had bought a shirt from a brother, not particularly at that event, which had on one side of the shirt, on one side of the shirt, all the social ills that affect our communities. And on the other side of the shirt, it showed none of these social ills, and this was a period before we came to America. So the social ills were developed in America, they weren't existing in Africa. So it just showed that. So what are the traditions that we worked and built and shared and developed and passed down for generation to generation to prohibit these type of social ills from occurring? And it's not just the modernization of the world that produces these social ills, because there are some countries that still don't have these social ills that are modern countries. So it just shows that our traditions have the healing and remedial effect that they could have if we were to go back and reclaim them. And
so these are things we can do before 2011.
That's exactly right.
See, we can take an interest, self-interest. Nothing's going to beat self-interest. We can take interest in ourselves and in healing ourselves. You know, certainly we know that we are entitled to redress. And certainly we should not give up the struggle to keep that before the people who have the capability of redressing those grievances. But at the same time, there's something that we need to do as families, as communities. There's work that we need to do. If you don't know you're an African, but one day of your life, that is the best day you will ever live. You know?
That's right.
If you're a person of African descent and you don't know yourself but one day, that's better than not ever having known yourself at all.
That is exactly right.
And it's not a matter of being anti-anything, it's just a matter of being pro-self. And my grandchildren tell me that they are learning about the Holocaust. It's part of the school curriculum. They feel so sorry for what happened to the children who suffered during the Holocaust.
That period.
But they don't know about the Ma'afa. And so they have no idea that how much their own people have suffered. That doesn't say that you're not You don't have compassion for other people who
sympathy.
suffer. But it does say that it puts a balance rather than seeing it as we have never suffered, then let's see that we have suffered. And let's see two things about that. Let's see that we are prevailing despite suffering, that we plan to be here.
Exactly.
And the other thing, let's also see that suffering is imposed, and that if you're not careful, you will get it imposed on you
Again.
frequently.
That's right.
So we need, but for our children, and some people tell me, well, you know, that was then, this is now, or I don't want to bring that up, you know, because I'm ashamed of chattel slavery. I'm not ashamed of us.
Right.
I'm not ashamed that we were hoodwinked and kidnapped and by the long and torturous route wound up in this situation that we find ourselves in. Because I know that part of that was the same thing we see now. And part of that was they stole the children.
Right. And eliminated those who were most clearest and thinkers and builders of family and community and resistance.
And we see
they've
that
done that today.
Right,
Same
and we
thing
see
today.
that repeatedly when if you read Mein Kampf or anything about the Third Reich, one of the things you see is that the children were corrupted.
Yeah.
Some so much that they would turn in their own parents because they so identified with that regime. So stealing the children, corrupting the children, you don't have to physically run off with the bodies of the children to steal. If you steal the children's minds, you know, Negro College. United Negro College Fund says a mind is a terrible thing to waste. So if you steal the minds of the children by giving them toxic music and toxic food and toxic images on the screen, you know.
Constantly.
Absolutely. Now you have stolen their identity. You have stolen their minds. And they are pawns. They are instruments to be used against their own people.
Exactly.
So we have some work to do. I'm glad to see you doing your share.
Yeah, well, you know, there's a lot of areas that a lot of work has to be done in, and so we've chosen this one because we think once a victory is won, and we think it will be in our lifetime, and certainly that's what I'm working for, that would have such a monumental impact on all of the things that you talked about. Yeah. But at the same time, we support and work with all the brothers and sisters who are doing things right now to repair our people internally. Yeah.
Well, the thing is that if you're not engaged in something that will serve to improve the quality of life for people, you know, because if you improve the quality of life for any human beings, be they of African descent or not, you are improving the quality of life for the community as a whole. And when I think about reparations, I cannot help but think about the indigenous population. Because the indigenous population deserve reparations more than anybody else. They were here. It was their land. They used the land minimally because they were in harmony with the way the land was made, you know, so they didn't feel like they had to sacrifice all the animal life and destroy all the plant life. You know, they didn't think they had to pollute the water and the air and stuff. You know, they were able to live reasonably well, not doing any of this. So now we have all these cities and these urban centers where, you know, where people think, you know, this is really the best way of life because we have skyscrapers and we have, you know, we have electric trains and we have all this convenience and so forth and so on. a heavy price was paid.
Yeah.
There's a lot of blood in this
Sure.
in this soil.
Yeah, and this way of life.
And so those people who have been consigned to reservations, who have been consigned to addictions of every kind,
Right.
including alcoholism, you know, who are remnants in some cases of the people that they were. If we want to know how bad things can get,
Exactly.
all we got to do is remember that there was something like about 12 million indigenous people when the European settlers came. And if you've seen one lately, you let me know.
All right. All right.
Somehow the 12 million that should have increased and increased and increased as people do, if they are left to thrive, they have progeny, and their progeny have progeny, and then they have generations that follow generations, and they become greater and more.
Right.
So now when have you passed an indigenous person on the street and been able to recognize that that was an indigenous person?
Not since I lived in Minneapolis.
Okay.
You have to be there. Yeah. As you said, there were another number. There were 40 million Amerindians in the Caribbean and South America and Central America in 1492. And less than 8 years later, that was down to about 400,000. So, yeah. So if you want to look at
So if you want to look at how far things can go once there have been invasions of your privacy and people encroaching upon your way of life, upon your environment, upon where you live, then you just look at, and I don't take these numbers really seriously because I know who's doing the counting, you know, and I realized that there was an indigenous population that is virtually non-existent, you know, and wherever they are found, they are not doing well unless they are the few who are operating a casino. So unless we want to look ahead at that possibility that we could be reduced, I don't think we understand how populations can be reduced astronomically, you know, can just evaporate, you know. And I think that we, you know, almost every people who have any intelligence take survival and development
very
very
seriously.
seriously.
Yeah. Also, in regards to Native Americans, early this year, they received a reparation payment of $3.4 billion.
Oh, very
early
good.
this month, I should say, that President Obama signed $3.4 billion.
All right.
And that argument was based on a trust violation that the American government had with the Native American community. When they signed the treaties with the Native Americans, their land actually went in trust, and the trust was held by the American government for the beneficiary of the Native Americans. At that same time, they entered into a trust agreement with Africans who lived in the Native American community. So right now there's a suit by Dr. Claude Anderson for black Indians who trust relationship with the American government via those treaties where they were spelled out in those Native American treaties. That trust agreement was violated also by the United States government. So this has been a 15-year fight with the Native Americans that was just settled in December of this year. And there's now a present suit for black Indians, which we think the same law applies. So they should be victorious. But knowing the history of this country, you know, when it comes to black people, you know, the same laws do not apply equally. But they should be victorious with this lawsuit for black Indians. We think it will play out for African Americans, that we can piggyback off of that type of victory.
Well, you know that we have to be vigilant,
Yeah.
and we have to fight for what is right.
Yeah.
That's always a good thing to do, you know, and not to be complacent and be full of doubt and ignorance, because very often not knowing something prevents you from taking action or
Sure.
behaving at least appropriately in the situation. So I think that, you know, to have people like you who are constantly trying to make the case, trying to make people understand what it is we're talking about, what it is we seek, and why it is necessary, you know, to seek this is very important. And, you know, they want to keep giving me little cues, but it's very, I'm very happy that you have covered this much of it, because when you're talking about zeroing in on Black History Month and making it meaningful in terms not just of learning about historical figures, but actually having themes. That's a new idea and an innovation that I think is right on time. We should be doing that, but we should be doing in all of these places where we gather, whether they are churches or block clubs or whatever. We should always be thinking about how we can learn more about not only our past, but our present condition.
Exactly.
So that we are in a position to be able to say something about what our future will be.
I agree totally. I agree totally.
Well,
Yeah.
I'm so happy that you came, and I'm very glad to
Thank you.
see that you have reduced this to something that somebody could read and understand. And I wish there would be one of these posted in every public building, so that people could walk past and look and stop and read. And so you keep up the keep up the good work, as they say. And if there's any way that you want people to reach in Cobra, they can call me. And I will pass on the information. Anybody seeking further information, or you know, how to join, or how to support, or how to question, you know, your activities, then I'd be happy to pass that information on.
We'd be very happy and thankful for that.
I know you will, and I appreciate you, Kamm Howard.
There's a lot of work, and we need workers.
I'm sure you do.
Yeah,
and
it's a
I'm
lot of
sure
work.
you must be a self-supporting organization.
We are.
Yeah.
It's a membership organization. We're totally funded by our membership.
Right.
Yeah.
Which is the only way you'll be independent.
Exactly.
Because if you have sponsors, your sponsors are going to pull the strings.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And most of our members are, you know, we reach deep to keep this organization moving forward.
Right. I was with somebody who was telling me how much money they tied to their church, and I just said, you know, I think it's a good tithing is a good idea, but you ought to diversify.
Yeah.
You know, because there are so many good causes that go wanting because you can't get the money that you need. So diversify your tithing. That's the message for today. Hotep.